stay hungry, stay foolish.
Before we launch into part 2 of The Science of Hate with Matt Williams, I want to thank our sponsor Zai, boldly transforming the future of financial services with a suite of embedded products and services, enabling businesses to manage multiple payment workflows and move funds with ease. Check out Zai at hellozai.com. It's great to welcome back the author of The Science of Hate, Professor Matthew Williams. Welcome back, sir.
Awesome to be back.
It's great to have you back. I was joking with you before we came on air. I have a quote that I was going to start off with, and it's by a certain president, and I can't say the name because it's going to affect the algorithm. And we're like, well, that's actually part of the problem that we're going to be talking about today is the rise of the bots, the problem with algorithms, filter bubbles, echo chambers, and how they have a massive impact on our ideas of prejudice and our information sourcing, or not, as the case may be. But this quote was by this president in a country that's at war, and he said, whoever becomes the leader in artificial intelligence will become the ruler of the world. And I thought, how apt, because it has such an impact on how people are incited. It's a huge accelerant towards hate that you talk about in the book. And I thought, you know, I did a little experiment myself, and I said to people, oh, you're being manipulated by algorithms all the time. And even I think it myself, and I go, no, I'm in control. And actually, that's the problem. We think we're in control. And much of the work that you do in Hate Lab shows us how we're not, how little we're in control of the information, how what we search for has a dramatic impact on what we see, and then that creates a worldview. If you're started off on the internet as tabula rasa, you're certainly not tabula rasa by the end of the day, because so much of the internet is controlled by bots and artificial intelligence. So I thought we'd start off, as you do in the book, on this chapter about Eliza, Tay, and then the 50 Cent Army, which is probably the most interesting aspect of all this.
It's a really good demonstration, I think, of how the internet is different in different parts of the world, and how that has an impact and an effect on how algorithms learn and then feedback information to us in these crazy feedback loops that we're always a part of, even though we might not realize it. One of the very first attempts at sort of artificial intelligence, or one might say one of the best tests of artificial intelligence, is the chatbot. The notion that if you can build a chatbot that is convincing enough to trick you into thinking it's a human, that the Turing test we're talking about here now, then we've created the true form of AI. Now, the Turing test obviously is controversial. It's an interesting test to identify whether or not a form of artificial intelligence might become self-aware, or if it can convince other humans that it is itself human. And one of the very first attempts at this was Eliza, which is this just simple chatbot that was developed, I think, in the 70s. And all it did actually was just feed back the same kinds of information to the human speaker. So a human speaker would say a sentence, and it would more or less repeat that sentence back to them, maybe with an inflection in the voice, or phrase it into a question. So it wasn't very sophisticated. It didn't convince anyone that it was another human, but it became kind of the barometer of what is what is artificial intelligence, or what scale it needs to be at to pass that Turing test, if you like. And Microsoft recently actually had another go at creating a chatbot called Tay, T-A-Y. Obviously, Microsoft have research divisions all over the world, in the US, in the UK, and in China and elsewhere. And this was a US-based research outfit that decided to create Tay and launch it on Twitter. Where better to launch a chatbot than on Twitter, eh? And it was a test of their intelligence. It was a test of their AI intelligence, and a test of a demonstration of how far that Microsoft had come in terms of developing these kinds of technologies. And, you know, rather benignly, Tay started off by saying something along the lines of "Hello world," I think was the first tweet that it posted. And people started to interact with it, curious as to how good this AI was. And Tay seemed pretty advanced. It was coming back with some really quite interesting speech formulations. It was able to interact with whatever people were throwing at it in a pretty convincing way. But within 24 hours, it had been radicalized, and it started to spew out racist, homophobic, transphobic bile overnight. And it was quickly taken down by its creators within minutes of it actually posting this stuff. And everyone started to ask questions. Why did this piece of software do this? Why did this happen? It's artificial intelligence, and then you start to dig a bit deeper into how it was created. Apparently, it was fed a lot of information on the internet to train its language model. So it was fed lots of speech from various social media sources so it could emulate human speech. So it looked at what was on the internet already and then trained its language model in an attempt to be a more effective communicator with a human. And of course, the content it was exposed to was vast, but also contained a lot of hate speech. And therefore, it learnt hate speech and started to spout that hate speech out. Now, that's, to me, not that surprising. What's really interesting, and this is what I write about in the book, is that Microsoft, around the same time, also created a Chinese version of Tay that fed off information on the Chinese internet, which is a very different kind of internet to the internet the rest of the world see. This is primarily because it's a heavily regulated internet. And you mentioned the 50 Cent Army. The Chinese government employ tens of thousands of people located in vast warehouses in different parts of China to monitor everything that gets posted on the Chinese internet. So anything that might be critical of the government or the status quo is either removed, or there is a lot of kind of counter messaging that tries to bring the population around to the most common way of the preferred way of thinking and posting. So the Chinese internet isn't really full of that much hate speech. It's certainly not full of much hate speech targeting the government. And it's a very different looking internet. Now, why that is interesting is because the chatbot that Microsoft created in China didn't engage in any hate speech whatsoever, because the language model it learned from, the Chinese internet, was devoid of all that controversial stuff because of that heavy censorship. Now, I'm not promoting a heavily censored internet. I'm just using this as an example of a natural experiment where you train one chatbot in the Western world based on sort of American social media, and you train one in China based on a very heavily censored internet, and it behaves very differently. And what this says is that the stuff that's on the internet, the content that's on the internet, on social media, on websites, etc., is incredibly biased, and it reflects back to us those biases on a routine basis, either via chatbots or algorithms of another nature. There's a really interesting study that looked to implement something called the implicit association test on the internet. So the IAT is a relatively straightforward test to try and tap into our implicit prejudices. It's designed in the following way. It shows you images of black and white faces flashing very quickly on a screen. And then in a quick association with that, it shows you a mix of good and bad words. And it tests your ability to associate good and bad words with black and white faces based on your keystroke of a keyboard. So it's so quick that you're not able to think very clearly about what you're doing. It's more of an instinctive reaction. And basically, the argument is if you are biased towards black faces or white faces, you're more likely, for example, to associate bad words with black faces and good words with white faces. It's come under criticism that, it's not heavily predictive of behavior in the real world, but the results are interesting. Now, what one academic decided to do was to see if he could actually sort of clone this experiment for the internet itself. And how they did that was that they looked for the mention of white-sounding names versus the use of black-sounding names, and then looked around those names in the same document to see what kinds of other words were proximate to it. And what it found was white names were far more likely to be surrounded by positive words versus black names that were far more likely to be surrounded by negative words. And that just shows you how biased the content on the internet actually is. And all it's doing, of course, is reflecting what we've put on it. We put this stuff on there. Human beings populated the internet with the information that sits on there. So all it's doing is reflecting back at us the prejudices that we have as individuals and as institutions. But the problem starts to get really scary when algorithms get involved and they are being trained to interact with humans and to make decisions based on the information that we put up there that's deeply, deeply prejudiced.
Some of your own findings from your own lab are really interesting. I thought perhaps we'd share, for example, you mentioned Google autocomplete. So when you're searching and the autocomplete, what it suggests, what's the words you're looking for here. And when you put in race or you put in religion, for example, it can suggest certain things. And I thought it was so interesting that, for example, in part one, we were talking about some of the harrowing cases that you mentioned in the book. And that unfortunately, just as it does in innovation, for example, one of the things we say in innovation is it's often the case that an organization waits till the crisis has happened to make the changes that should have been made anyway. So it's easier sometimes for a leader of an organization to save the organization after it's hit the iceberg, because then they become this big savior versus, well, maybe those decisions I made way back is why we never hit an iceberg in the first place. Nobody celebrates that. Nobody celebrates the prevention. It's always the savior after the case, etc. And you talk about these pivotal cases that often happen that are trigger events to make, for criminalization of certain acts, etc. And that's a huge point. But then that also happens on the internet. We also wait until there's some type of terrible case in order to make actions, to make cases, to make change that's so necessary. And I say all that to say, you talk about this, that even though the big tech giants have been warned to make the changes, they often don't make the changes until there's a threat of a big fine. So you see this, for example, in Germany with certain regulations versus the UK, for example.
You started off with that example of Google and my bit of research and just typing in search terms, and it was quite surprising. It actually changed during the writing of my book. They changed the algorithm during the writing of my book because they'd been called up by governments in the UK and elsewhere for allowing their AI to run amok and make pretty racist, homophobic suggestions as search terms. So, I typed in, for example, queers are in the algorithm, and one of the suggestions to autocomplete the search was are an abomination. So it's pretty offensive to see that reflected back at you as a valid search query. And Google, to their defense, if I were to ever defend them, said that that's based on what people are searching for. All we're doing is showing you what most people search for when they search for the term queers. And I'm like, well, I don't want that shoved back in my face. Thank you very much. I know that there are lots of people that are prejudiced using search engines and Twitter and Facebook, etc. But you're perpetuating it by suggesting it's a valid search term. And you do it now. Yeah? Any of your listeners can go onto Google now and type in, say, blacks are, Jews are, and it won't give you many suggestions. In fact, I think if you type in blacks are, there are no suggestions at all, because they switched the suggestion off for that particular search, because it always came up with racist content based on what people are searching for, which is incredibly depressing. They did change the algorithms once it was brought to their attention. They had a similar problem with their translate function. So, for example, if you were translating from one language to another that, say, didn't have gender pronouns in the same way that, say, English does, say, Finnish, for example, it would always associate, say, for example, certain roles as either male or female in the English translation, even though in the native there was neither male or female associated with it. So, for example, if you were to type in they are a doctor, it might come back with he is a doctor versus they are a nurse, would come back with she is a nurse, for example. I mean, less problematic, some might think, but it's still perpetuating these sort of gender norms, which are problematic, and you wouldn't want to teach your kids that. But again, it's just another example of how these algorithms that are perceived as relatively benign are allowed to run without any significant oversight until a government or an organization flags it with them, and then they may or may not change the algorithm. So Google did respond to that. They also responded with YouTube and the algorithm that tended to promote more extreme content over less extreme content because it kept people on the platform for longer. But it did take a lot of pressure. And you're right. Can we get these big social media companies to change their behavior? The problem for me is that the algorithms that are most dangerous, and these are the engagement algorithms that keep you on the platform for longer, once they turned them on and they started seeing those dollars roll in like never before, it's going to take a lot to get them turned off and to see those profits tumble and them accept that as a consequence of their actions. Basically, these algorithms work out what keeps us glued to our screens. Unfortunately, because of various aspects of human nature and evolution, we're very often glued to more negative stuff than positive stuff. It goes back to the amygdala and the brain stuff. Basically, we're constantly on the lookout for threats because, as a species, we are experts at survival. And we always will seek out bad news over good news because we want to be aware of our threat environment. What's the threat landscape look like? So we're always attached to more extreme negative news than we are positive news. Not to say that those videos and images of cats, kittens, and dogs don't keep us glued. They do the same kind of thing for a very different reason. But the more extreme, that's why you see them so much, because they're also being promoted by the algorithms. But conversely, we're also getting the really bad and really extreme stuff. And because the algorithms learn that keeps us on for a few seconds longer, which means that we can be advertised to for a few seconds longer, they just sort of perpetuate that process. And I think at one point Jack Dorsey, before he left Twitter, became sort of deeply aware of the consequences of the engagement algorithm when they changed their timeline algorithm. And there was some talk of him even potentially suggesting that Twitter turn it off, but he left Twitter before he could actually see that through. And even if he would have done it in the end, we don't know. But ultimately, it still works, it still operates, and all the big social media giants are doing it. It's the same with TikTok right now. I find that platform incredibly sticky. I cannot stop looking at it, and it drives me nuts. And they've figured out a new way of keeping us engaged. And that's not to keep us engaged based on people who we follow as such, but more to do with interests that we have. And they literally, are able to monitor how many milliseconds you're engaging with a piece of content. And it deeply shapes what you see next. I remember actually creating another account away from mine just to test the algorithm. And I, for example, started to look at a lot of a conspiracy theory and misinformation posts about vaccine, about the COVID-19 vaccine and other things. And, I just watched one full video on sort of conspiracy theory about the vaccine. And that's all I got. I may have had a couple of videos that were not related to it, but everything else I got was about sort of anti-vax and other conspiracy theories associated with it. And it was just so shocking that I actually couldn't get out of that spiral. I was stuck in it, so I had to delete the account. I actually told TikTok this. I advised TikTok on some of their hate policy stuff. And I actually said to the guys in the team, who said, I did this and I got stuck in this loop and I had to delete my account. And they looked at me and they were somewhat sort of taken aback by the fact that I'd done that. And they were kind of like, okay, thanks for telling us about that, And they weren't surprised, but they were surprised that I did it, I think. And it just shows you how these algorithms operate. And it's all about that sort of business model that they have. So, I'm not sure how how influential governments are going to be at convincing these massive corporations to change their models, because no amount of fine can change that kind of model. I mean, if they change the model, they'd lose more money than any fine could actually impose on a company. So we're in a sad state of affairs, and I think we're going to need a sort of a massive sea change in that sort of the culture of that industry, I think, to see anything major happen.
You were saying about TikTok, and one thing does really concern me, which is like the long form content that I publish on this show is, I mean, you've written the book. We will have done probably 2.5 hours, I'd say, by the time we finish, maybe more. And like that takes time to read the book, but then it still doesn't give a holistic picture of the book. Like we'll only get through probably in depth, maybe 3 or 4 chapters, if even. And then I've released a new part of the show called Innovation Bites, BYTES, and the whole concept of that as well. I get so many people saying they prefer shorter form content, and I kind of go, yeah, I know, but it feels wrong to do that, because you can only see it from, you only get a slice of the perspective when you get that short bite. I mean, you can chop a bite anyway, which way you want to sound or confirm whatever biases you have in the first place. And I thought I'd say that because that is very much on my mind all the time. But then when you talked about, for example, algotransparency.org, which is a website former Google employee went and created, and you talk about what happened happens a lot of people. So we saw a spike because of fearful the climate, the accelerants of hate, as you talk about, but also the accelerants of conspiracy theories as well, was during the pandemic. We saw a huge spike in conspiracy theories, both about the pandemic itself, but about lots of different things. And, the dots connect and in crazy ways for many, many people. And what happens to them is then they go down into their content platform and they get stuck down a rabbit hole somewhere. And then they think that's reality. And then on top of that, if you add in, like you talk about, and perhaps you'll elaborate on this, if you talk about, well, if stuff's tweeted, for example, and then you have bots in places like Russia or Afghanistan retweeting, that shows validation of those tweets. Oh, what the heck? That's got 1,000 retweets? Oh my God, it must be real. That's really, really dangerous.
Yeah, and I think it's important to emphasize that the role of bots are, multifaceted, in the sense that some of them can be driven purely by sort of code or a form of AI, but more often than not, bots are controlled by individuals and organizations. They're kind of fake accounts that have automated elements to them, but they have an agenda. And that agenda may favor a state in one way or another. And we've seen that happen quite a lot with trigger events and the online reaction to trigger events, and where disinformation and misinformation as well is perpetrated, perpetuated by an army of bots. And the Internet Research Agency in Russia, for example, has been implicated in lots of different things, including election tampering. But also we found that bots associated with that organization also inflamed misinformation around terror attacks in the UK. For example, there was an image, for example, of a woman in a headscarf walking past the victim following the London Bridge terror attack, and the image suggested that she was sort of quite blasé about the whole thing and was on her phone and walking away, not even looking or caring about the victim, and that was amplified by bots associated with the Internet Research Agency in Russia. It received, tens of thousands of retweets and likes, and it turned out that it was false information, because another picture had been taken from another angle that clearly showed the woman was in distress and that she was completely aware of the situation and was clearly empathetic because she was tearful. And, that wasn't shared in anywhere near as much. But the whole agenda there was, let's sow division between groups in the United Kingdom at this very sensitive time in the wake of this terror attack, because any division is good for our country. If we can divide a country along classic lines of division, one being race, the other being religion, etc., then it weakens a country. The more I guess cooperative and cohesive a country is, the stronger it is. The more divided it is, the weaker it is. And this is the kind of playbook of sort of the Russian agencies, in a sense. It's kind of what you see continuously, this kind of continuous undermining of democracies and of states. And they're now using all technology at their disposal to achieve this. And that was a really interesting and terrifying example of where those bots were heavily involved in sort of falsely promoting, seemingly by individuals that had their own minds, a story that was a clearly misrepresented one. And yeah, it's terrifying to see that happen. We've also, in the book, I talk about the horrendous case in Myanmar and the Rohingya genocide, and the role that Facebook had in that. To think that a social media company would have a role in such a horrendous genocide it seemed at one point to be sort of an unthinkable thing, really. But even the UN had come out in its report and said that Facebook had a sort of deciding factor, an incredibly influential factor in stirring up of hatred in that country and the sort of mass killing of the Rohingya minority. And Facebook just put their hands up and said, sorry, yeah, you're right. We did. We released our technology in that country at a time when citizens in that country weren't very used to having mobile phones. It was too expensive to have mobile phones. And then overnight tax laws were changed, which meant that mobile phones became affordable. And the first thing that the population downloaded was Facebook, because ultimately Facebook was the only platform, unlike other platforms at the time, that had a option for their language. So they were using it to communicate with each other. And, it went from like no one using Facebook to like 80% of the country using Facebook in the space of, a couple of years. And it became the main form of communication. And the authorities took great advantage of that and started to spread vile, hateful disinformation about the minority. And there was no attempt to stop it. One of the main reasons Facebook said was, we had very few people who could speak the local language in our moderation teams, and it was really hard to get people to moderate. And that was it. That was the sort of the limit of their excuse, and it just wasn't good enough. Their algorithms didn't work on the language, so they couldn't automatically detect false and misleading and hateful information. They didn't have enough moderators speaking the local language to distinguish between what was true and false, and it was just let to run wild, and it played a decisive factor in that genocide. And it's amazing that so few people speak about it. I mean, it's becoming more well known as time goes by, but there was clearly not enough outrage at the involvement of Facebook in that case at that time. And, this is why I delve into it in the book, because I think we all need to learn about that and the role it played. Because if it can play a role like that in one part of the country, one part of the world, I should say, it can do the same in another. The one thing they did come out and say was that, we're going to change policies. So, when we do sort of launch our technology in a developing country that's not very tech savvy, the population weren't very tech savvy, because they weren't giving any tech for a long time, we will put extra safeguards in place. They didn't say what those would be, and we're not entirely sure if they were implemented. But yeah, I mean, it was such a shocking example of where social media has been implicated in the worst kind of sort of massacre, and the consequence seemed to be negligible for the company.
One of the things I was thinking about was how many people didn't take menopause that seriously as a really huge impact on society until Davina McCall got involved, and you had this kind of spokesperson for it, and then that ignited the change in some way. And I say that to say that we often wait till it's too late. We wait till there's a problem. We saw it in the floods in the States, for example. People knew there was problems with the walls. The flooding happens, then it's like, oh, we'll fix it afterwards. What I love about what you do in Hate Lab is your tech can sniff out when things are, it's velocity. It's when things are starting to change. When there's an accelerant being put in place, you can spot it in real time versus what the police do. And this is for a lack of education and lack of tech and lack of holistic understanding that criminology does, is that you can see it from a wide range of angles while they only see it after the fact. So it's your predictive and their post-analytical.
It came about because there was this kind of gap in the market, really. It seemed like there was lots of tech out there for monitoring things like brand interactions, awareness, and reactions, and so on. But there was nothing out there that would allow NGOs, those with a remit to monitor hate speech, those to hold the social media organizations to account, to identify perpetrators, and so on and so forth, with a tech that could identify sort of different forms of problematic speech. Hate speech is probably the common term for it. And, because the market wasn't there, it was left to scientists and NGOs to kind of come up with the tech. And we were lucky enough to get some seed funding to build the tech and then offer it to these organizations that do a fantastic job of monitoring the sort of the pulse of the nation or the pulse of certain areas on social media in real time, that allows us then to identify when, say, there are rising tensions in an area around a certain topic, for example, very often before the authorities would pick it up. And it was an eye on the world that we'd never had before. And the speed and the volume of information was unprecedented, and we needed new tech and a dedicated team to kind of harness this new powerful form of data that gave us this kind of early warning system, if you like. And yeah, we're now in that position where we've built the tech and it's being used by sort of all different types of organizations just to monitor hate speech in certain contexts, and the vision is to basically democratize this form of technology that itself uses AI, very much like the social media companies, but we've turned the AI on its head, if you like. Instead of the AI promoting extremist attitudes, it now looks for extremist attitudes and then flags to us when they go over a certain level, and an alarm will go off, and we can identify what's unfolding on the streets. And our vision is to sort of democratize that kind of technology amongst organizations that try to sort of protect democracy, to try to protect minority groups in certain countries. I would have loved to have had this tech in Myanmar when all that was kicking off and Facebook was being used to stoke that fire. And the technology, hopefully, I envisage it being able to pick up this kind of unprecedented rise in hate speech and disinformation. And the vision is, once it's happening, what can we do to stop it? Can we inject some counter narrative into that information flow? Can we actually, get folks on the boots on the street and try to address whatever problems unfolding there? And that's the dream. And I think, we've got a long way to go before we can realize that, because we're still at that stage where we've got this minimal viable product that actually works quite well. But, we need to take it further so we can sort of democratize this technology amongst organizations that sort of protect democracies around the world.
I thought we'd finish on solutions, and I pulled a quote that I absolutely love, because again, I meant I think throughout the book, it's very clear you're an optimist and that you're sharing this content in a consumable, accessible way to help people make more valid decisions. And I love this quote, and maybe it'll take us to maybe a finale of what we can do about it. What, if we encounter hate speech ourselves, rather than just be passive about it, what we can do about it, etc. Because you say in the book that one of the encouraging aspects of what you found from 20 years of research, essentially, and then the concentrated effort of you and your team in Hate Lab is that that it maintains your faith in the wisdom of the crowd. And you say that counter hate speech always outweighs hate speech following trigger events. In the UK, for example, following the Brexit vote, hate speech on Twitter was dwarfed by those social media users who came to the support of the targeted victims, which was really encouraging because it can be turned, the tide can be turned. The other aspects we talked about, police education, building trust between police and witnesses and victims, for example, that they don't feel they can't come forth, all this kind of stuff. It's a systemic issue. So there's so many nodes of the network that needs to be solved or needs to be improved in order to make the entire network and the system better as a result. But maybe you have a couple of final messages for us on an individual level of what we can do about it.
Yeah, I mean, that's the one thing that keeps me sane is when we've got an eye on all the vile, extreme stuff on social media, we can also see all the good stuff, the healthy conversations that are unfolding. And yeah, I mean, I have faith in humanity, just by looking at something like Twitter and Facebook, because there's so much more positivity on there than there is negativity. I mean, just to give you a rough estimate, when we see an event unfold, only around 1% of the traffic sort of is hateful. But of course, you've got hundreds, maybe thousands of victims in that 1% being targeted, of course. So it's the scale of social media and the speed of social media that's causing this kind of this problem. And 1% of a billion posts is a hell of a lot of posts. And ultimately, I don't want to dwarf the size of the problem by using percentages, but 99% of those communications are then more neutral or positive in orientation. And very often, if someone is being targeted, you do see folks coming to their defense, and put themselves sometimes in harm's way in doing so, using their counter speech and counter narratives to try and correct the speech of the perpetrator. And that is heartwarming when you see that unfold, and it's a powerful thing. And yeah, the wisdom of the crowd, the ability and the power of people when they come together is something to behold, and we see it on a daily basis on social media when someone is attacked. Unfortunately, we do get polarization on social media, and the algorithms are partly responsible for that, and communities form and become even more polarized. And counter speech is important in trying to depolarize, and sometimes it's effective and sometimes it's not. But I think my message to listeners would be, if they do see hate speech on social media, not to just scroll on by, do something about it, report it to the platform if you don't want to engage. If you do feel like you want to engage, then do so, but with appropriate safeguarding. Don't go in and use hate speech yourself. Go in and try to reason with the person if you can. If you're not getting anywhere, get out of that conversation, then maybe report it to the platform. But if you do seem to get somewhere with the person you're speaking to, and they seem to be coming around, continue that engagement. And I think, in about 50% of cases, you are going to get people responding with further questions about your position if you're using counter speech, because a lot of the folks that go on social media to say these things, these hateful things, are young people. They are young, impressionable people that are reachable with logic and kindness and education. And I think we have to realize that they're not these sort of mission haters that I talked about earlier. They are impressionable young minds, and I think we have to see them as that. At least assume that the person sending the hate speech is redeemable, is a person that can change. And I think if we do that, we kind of win half the battle. And this is what I see constantly on social media, that that those that are involved in it are young, impressionable minds that can be changed, and with appropriate counter speech, they will stop engaging in that kind of hate speech. And I think that's an important lesson that we've learned empirically in the lab.
Amen, brother. And Matt, for people who want to find you, reach out to you, I mentioned in the last episode that you have that tech you're looking for to spin out. Maybe somebody will know a company or be an investor themselves. They might be interested. Where can they find you?
That'd be great. Yeah, hatelab.net is the lab webpage. And you can get in touch with us there and get up to date with all our latest research.
The author of The Science of Hate, How Prejudice Becomes Hate and What We Can Do About It. Professor Matt Williams, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.